in this one, I want to spend time to properly explore the dura, the membrane around, or that lines the skull and lines the spinal cord. This membrane for me has come a cropper from the image of the blood-brain barrier. Now, it isn't the image portrayed, or it's not openly talked about in the books, anatomy books, but it is inferred by the anatomy books. And the blood-brain barrier is how the blood comes into the cranium and brain, turns into cranial fluid, and rather than calling that a filter or something life-affirming, they've called it a barrier. And that is to preserve I don't know the word, of refined fluid in the brain. The cranial fluid is very refined. It's 99% water, so it's probably one of the most, or the most, refined fluids in the body. And because the filter running into it is very refined, it won't let kind of parasites through, or viruses. Some viruses may manage to get through, but it's a tight filter. It only lets through pure water and the other things the filter wants to let through. Now, the other place that may intrude upon the whole central nervous system and the cranial fluid is from the outside. What is surrounding it, which is the dura all the way through, and the nerves flowing out through the dura. So also no toxins, viruses, anything that's normally in the blood can't come back through those areas into the central nervous system and spoil this very refined medium there. And that's why I think they say nothing can go out through the dura, or the cranial fluid can't flow out through the dura, and it can't flow out through the nerves. But if you look at it, it is patently obvious that there's nothing to stop that fluid flowing out through the nerves. And it's 99% water. Water will go through any membrane in the body, whether you call it the dura or not. So I don't like that word, the blood-brain barrier. I think it portrays a global image which is very unhelpful for people's health. It divides and isolates the whole central nervous system, and I think the picture shown of the central nervous system stops people advancing spiritually. Just that whole image. I'm not going to show it. You can come to the free webinars where I show all of that to get a full picture on that. But I won't be using that word again. The filters that comes in to the central nervous system, that's through, I just call that the epi filter, which is the epidermal fluid cells that filter the blood to make cranial fluid, and the endofilter, which is the endothelial cells which filter the blood to make cranial fluid. And for me, how the filter works in the dura around the brain, and the nerves flowing off through the brain and central nervous system, is that there's a continuous flow of fluids out through the nerves, which is stopping anything flowing in through the nerves. So The filter is that it's flowing out all of the time at a speed faster than anything can swim back into the central nervous system. Through the dura, for me, you know, I don't think it will flow out through it and the speed that is going to flow out through the nerves, but it is porous. Water will flow through every membrane, but some membranes it will flow through more slowly, and as the dura is quite thick connective tissue, I can, you know, fully and happily think that it will flow out fairly slowly through that. And now what science is finding, and they're kind of trying to use it, because there's, in their whole description of the central nervous system, there's no lymph or nothing that does the job of the lymph, so they've got to show that dynamic. So they've found these areas of the dura that does have lymph in it, and they've found that the toxins and cranial fluid does flow into that lymph, but it's nothing even close to the volume of fluid that it would need to be to justify the central nervous system not having lymph. So, but the thing is, in showing those pictures of lymph in the dura, the cranial fluid does have to flow through a certain thickness of dura to get to the lymph. And if it can flow through a bit of the dura, thickness of the dura, it can flow through the whole of the dura. And if it can flow quite easily into that lymph, it can flow quite easily through that whole membrane. And the dura is described as a thick, I mean, the dura mater, mother of all membranes. you can the dura that goes around the spine, you can hang that over rope and hang from it. It's very strong, but in the name of it and how it's viewed, and that cranial fluid can't flow out through it, it gives a rather dry image. Whereas we're going to work with it today that at the very least it can fill up with cranial fluid, and this gives it a whole different feel to it. And once the cranial fluid starts flowing into it, cranial fluid is a purveyor of light, and once the cranial fluid starts flowing into it, that light starts filling through the dura. I'll explain a bit what the dura is. It lines the whole inside of the brain, it lines that whole spine. I will show some pictures of it in a little while, just so people know what it is. In my battles to somehow regain health from Lyme's disease, I would get this gripping tiredness in my throat and thyroid that was almost unbearable, and it felt more than tiredness. It felt like entities were coming into me, or that I was dying, and I would do whatever I could to let the energy go through there. And when I would finally be able to let that energy travel through the neck and throat, instantly it went into the surrounds of the brain, it went into the dura, and I could feel like that I was feeling the tiredness here and I was feeling the block here, but the real block was that I was avoiding the experience of death in the dura, that the dura had become tight and was no longer breathing, and I could feel the Lyme's disease, those little spirochetes that are they're spiral bacteria, and they will burrow into connective tissue to hide from the immune system. And they will breathe there and they will live there. And I was scared to let that breathe, because unconsciously I knew it was there, because I didn't want the spirochetes that were living in the dura to come out and more spread into the brain, where they can burrow into the myelinating glial cells. That's the myelin sheath, through the brain and through the body. I actually felt that they were better off there. And it's not a feeling of tiredness there, it's a feeling of death. It's going to kill you. Things that attack the brain, it's a bit like they're going to kill you. And a lot of people say that in Lyme's disease. They say, well, it's not so much tiredness, I'm dying, it's going to kill me. And it is that feeling. It has this feeling that it's going to kill you. It doesn't really want a quick death, because that's the end of the Lyme's disease. It will preserve you for as long as it can. And the other way is it works into the hypothalamus area and different areas of the brain to do with your immune system, and undermines your immune system so you can't fight it back, or any other diseases. And a lot of people from Lyme's disease just die from the onslaught of every single little virus or bacteria that goes around. So I have a history and a good reason for working with the dura. And in Lyme's disease, also into the joints, into the connective tissue through the whole body. These become inflamed. People get like a lot of arthritis in their hands and things like that. And MS, really, it's misdiagnosed as MS. And that is the yellow energies. We have the organs of the yellow energies: the stomach, the spleen, the esophagus and the tongue. And that's on the organs level. And from the pelvis, the kundalini of the yellow energies is the clitoris for the women, and the erectile tissue of the penis for men. But through the body, it's the connective tissue. And working with this, I call it the dura mater, the mother of all duras. The dura around the spine, around the brain, seems to me to be the central brain for the connective tissue through the whole body. In that from there it spreads out through the whole communication of the whole body. And I can remember 10 years or so ago, people started finding out about the connective tissue through the whole body, and that it was like a brain, had an incredible intelligence and memory of traumas and all these different things. A lot was held in this, from any single bit of connective tissue anywhere in the body, you can connect to every other bit of connect by a continuous unbroken line. So it is an important thing. And on a global level, I feel it's been undermined by this picture of a dry membrane or thick, strong membrane, and by it being said that the cranial fluid, that it isolates the cranial fluid. The cranial fluid can't flow through it, and that it continues out as the outer membrane around the nerves for me as well. It is one continuous thing. And also I think it's suffered from the name, the blood-brain barrier, and we're going to do whatever it takes to realign that. And also, as I work with it more and more, what I'm enjoying is the kundalini that travels through the dura. It's not just the Kundalini travels through the bones of the spine or through the neurons and axons and different glial cells through the spine and brain, but it lights up the dura around the brain. And I remember that as my first ever experience of Kundalini. I was already on a spiritual path in that for years. You know, at school I was always doing healing and massage without really knowing what I was doing. But I had taken too many drugs, and it was just before my 21st birthday, and I wasn't very good at drugs, and I was lying on my bed and I was stoned from marijuana, and I was just really paranoid. And in my mind I was just thinking, there must be a way around this paranoia, and I found a way to drop back from those sensations in my mind, so I was more a viewer. And instantly there was this explosion of energy up through my spine, and it lit up basically what I now see as the dura, because it did light up in the brain, but it was much more right around the whole brain, that the dura and cranial fluid around it just lit up bright in this bright explosion. And then that all went down, and then it happened again, these two big pops, and I thought, well, there goes another 1 million brain cells. I didn't really realize what it was, but then 2 weeks later I was actively engaged in a spiritual journey. It kind of, even though I didn't know it, led me into that. So you do get a really nice Kundalini with the dura, but you have to learn how to breathe with it. You have to let it become immersed in the cranial fluid and not something that isolates the brain and central nervous system, something that will just slowly let that fluid morph through it and then come out through the dura and then enter into the lymph, which is the cranial fluid, or the used cranial fluid in the brain is kind of the lymph for the cranial fluid, and that flows into the lymph for the body, and that flows back to the heart to be reconstituted. So what we're building today is a new picture. And even if you don't know anatomy, people have know the name, the blood-brain barrier, and that produces an image. So we're producing a new image. Images are incredibly important for how we progress. So it's interesting how all of these different webinars just seem to flow in, even though I don't set out to do that in that way. They all kind of flow in and out of each other in different ways. So we're working with that today. I'm also finding I've always had a slow digestion, and as to prepare for these, I spent a lot of time working with the dura, and I'm finding it is just enabling my whole digestive tract. It's a bit like this membrane around the brain and down the spine. Somehow that aligns with the whole digestive tract, and we will be working with it directly in line with the digestive tract, in that the dura around the whole brain, this makes like a round sac, and then it continues in a pipe going down the whole length of the spine. There's cranial fluid and then the spinal cord inside it. And where it's going through the foramen magnum, where it drops out through the brain and down the spine, that is like a diaphragm, and it relates a lot, or it's got a direct and exact energetic and pictorial relationship to the stomach, which is also like a cavernous area, and then that goes through the diaphragm, and then you've got the esophagus coming up. So that's like an upside down dura, or the dura is an upside down stomach and esophagus, and both of them come through a diaphragm. So we will be relating to those together, and working with this has changed my whole digestive system. I've made my own homeopathic remedies to just target the spirochetes in the dura, because I feel working with it, I want to, make sure that I'm not just littering my whole system with Lyme disease hiding there. And the Lyme disease, I was told, I've got a very good lady who tests me, and quite a while ago she said, no, you've cleared all the Lyme disease, and then later on it turned up at a higher potency. And then later, because there's about 50 or 60 different strains of Lyme disease, I just thought, I bet there's just a shed load of spirochetes that haven't been found or named. So rather than writing Lyme disease on the remedies I was making, I started writing spirochetes. It had a massive reaction, and when I took it to it, they all tested positive, that there were strains of Lyme disease that had never been named. But you just put in the word spirochete rather than Lyme, it picks up, and they were strongly in that area. So I've kind of, in a way, I've made the homeopathic remedies for myself and working with it with the dura. But I find as I work with the dura, it really brings a youth, and it really helps the breathing of the brain, and it really helps the detoxification of the brain. So not only is it allowing the cranial fluid to flow out through it, it is part of the breathing motion that starts releasing the toxins from the brain, and has been held into us. Those toxins from the brain have been literally held into us by an image of the blood-brain barrier. My view of that, and what I'd heard people saying, I know it's not accurate, hard to get toxins out of the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. I think a lot of people have something similar, or it puts this division or something there. But by allowing it to breathe and allowing the toxins and fluids just to flow out through the brain and out through the surrounding of the brain and out through the dura, it allows that whole area to detoxify, and you have an image of it detoxifying. And with working with that, I start feeling this youth, because it is really helping the toxics go. And you don't have to have Lyme disease or any crippling disease. I think just by having this image, just from the toxins in food, the toxins in the air, or the toxins from different viruses, makes a huge difference to people's health. So that is what we're going to be working with, is to change, or change that image, or just give a new image of how that isn't an isolated thing. So let's just look at some pictures of, and then we'll do that through the first part, and then in the second part we will work with the organs again. We'll see how that goes. It will almost certainly include the spleen. People seem to enjoy that, but we haven't worked in depth with the energy of the tongue yet. We did the throat in the first one. it dropped into the stomach for the second one. The third one was very much about the spleen. I think this one will incorporate the tongue, which brings them all together and opens the crown chakra. Thank you all for listening to me, by the way. I've realized that there is I think a lot of people just want to do breath work and do the meditations and things like that. Oh God, Martin's talking again. But for me, there's really a big offloading, being allowed to speak about how I see things and to speak about the images and how it's working. And there's a channel behind that. I know people enjoy the breath work, but the channel is coming through the speaking as well. And I can see it in the videos. When I'm editing the videos, I can see it, me just nattering away and nothing much is going on. There's a certain word or certain point, it just comes in, boom, and the whole thing takes on a depth and a strength that I don't normally have in my own speech. There's a power and levity that comes through with it. And I think I've spoken for a few minutes and it can just go on for ages. But that talking is doing something, and it's working on many levels. We're working on many levels here, and I'm truly thankful that these guides or energies or whatever it comes to me comes, because I think this wouldn't be anything without them. And I'm slowly finding that the people that are hanging around aren't in it so much for all the information and all the different things. They kind of like the feeling that goes with it. That is my impression. So thank you for putting up with me nattering. So here we have a brain, and you've got the cranial sea around the brain, and then lining the skull, this is the dura. It contains all of that cranial fluid is contained in it and is taught as this impervious membrane. But as far as I'm concerned, well, anyone is concerned, water will flow through any membrane, any cell, anywhere in the body. So 99% of the cranial fluid can flow out through it, and I'm sure the other 1% can, which is, well, in this case, leaving the brain, it will be carbon dioxide and toxins. I'm sure that can also. And now they're finding lymph actually within the dura, around this center line and into here. It isn't a massive amount, but the cranial fluid leaving has to flow through a certain thickness of the dura to get into that lymph, where it's taken into the lymph of the body. And they're describing it as flowing into it quickly. So it actually is flowing through the dura quickly to get to the lymph to get out. So if it can flow through that thickness, it can flow out directly through anywhere. And then this continues down the spine. And also in the free webinars I show how it flows out through the nerves. Now this is wider than it should be, and it shows the nerves as well. So you've got the brain here, and the dura is holding. Does that mean that water can penetrate through the dura into the usual? Yeah, water can travel through everything in the body. One of the fundamental principles of water is that it will flow through any membrane, any cell, anywhere, either by just a channel which it can flow just directly through, or by osmosis. So I think people probably saw this. We will be working with the falx here, but it's the lining of the brain and around the whole spine, that whole area. And the cranial fluid I'm talking about is the cranial sea that is produced from the endothelial cells and the ependymal cells, both exactly the same fluid, huge amount of it just flowing out, copious amounts, to feed every glial cell, everything through that whole system. And then it needs a decent way of getting, and quick way of getting out of the brain and central nervous system, other than the venous blood supply, because the venous blood can only take a certain proportion of it. The only way for it to flow out is through the dura, through the nerves. There's absolutely no other passage. So it has to go out. If you want to have an image of detoxifying your brain, you need an image like that. You need an image of it leading. You need an image of the brain with lymph. You need an image of those toxins leaving. So that is what we're providing, an image where you can view your brain detoxifying. And if you have that image, that changes health on pretty well every single level. If you've got an image of the brain that can't detoxify, if you've got an image of the brain that is isolated from the body, and the only thing that's taking fluid out of the brain is the venous blood, inside of yourself, whatever you know about anatomy, inside of yourself you know that isn't true. So this gives that image. So I'll just show some more pictures and then I'll give people a bit of time to talk. Oh, there's a dura. There it is. Kind of never offer to be kind of have someone paint anatomy pictures of you. So this is the dura cut from the top of the brain and opened up. So this is the membrane around the brain, and the cranial fluid or cranial sea is directly under that and then flows through the dura. And the esophagus, which we will be working with, this is the esophagus here, this is the pharynx, all up here, and this joins to the, you've got the esophagus coming up, and that actually joins to the underside of the cranium. You have the mouth here, the larynx here, and the nasal passageways there. And we'll be working with that as the diaphragm is dropping, it's pulling the stomach down, it's pulling the esophagus down, and that is connecting to the hyoid, the jaw, the tongue, the roof of the mouth, the top of the eyes, and creating this suckling motion from the diaphragm. I talk about it a lot, how it works through the ribs, but we're seeing how that works through the diaphragms. Okay, I think that's enough pictures. A lot of people here have done this quite a few times, so they know the anatomy. So I'll just open this up for any questions. I think it's 700 miles of capillaries in the brain. The blood flow comes into the brain, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, breaking up like a tree to tiny little branches, which are the capillaries. I think the total length of the capillaries in the brain are about 700 miles. Well, we might as well do this properly. So what creates this aqueous fluid in the brain is the filters around the around the capillaries, which is made of endothelial cells, and in the choroid plexus, which is in the ventricles, are the ependymal cells. Now, the blood goes to the brain, it breaks up into, I think, 700 miles of tiny capillaries. The capillaries get so small that there's only room for one blood cell to go through it. And the endothelial cells that go around the capillaries, one endothelial cell can go around the whole thing. So here we have the blood in the middle and this endothelial cell stretched around it. What makes this filter work in the brain, the endothelial cells come together in what's called a tight junction, which the blood doesn't have in the rest of the body. The endothelial cells in the rest of the body, this junction is wider, so all sorts of everything can flow through that. But a tight junction is so tight that only pure water can flow through it. So pure water can only flow out through that junction. Water will flow anywhere in the body if the pressure is greater on one side of the cell or membrane. The pressure is greater inside the capillary, so the water osmosis through this endothelial cell, and so you get pure water flowing out of the capillaries. And then this is an intelligent cell. It chooses, there will be toxins, there will be proteins, there will be fats, there will be viruses, there will be all sorts of things in there, and it chooses oxygen. It gives oxygen free passage through itself, it gives glucose free passage through itself, and it gives salt free passage. So you end up with a glucose oxygen salt sea. It's 99% water, and the last 1% is glucose, oxygen and salt. So that is inside the whole brain. That fluid is being produced inside the whole brain. This picture keeps trying to get away. There's 3 places, quite rare, there's 3 places in the brain that have tight junctions. The next one is in the choroid plexus, and are these ependymal cells. They have tight junctions which will only let pure water through them. This is the only place this happens in the body other than the placenta. The blood flow comes inside these sealed sacs of the choroid plexus. You get both the arterial capillaries and the venous capillaries go back. The arterial ones just open and they let all of the blood come out, which is what happens in the placenta. So this is just full of just about everything from my understanding of it. And then only pure water is allowed through there. So you get pure water coming into the ventricles. And then these are intelligent cells. Rather than taking in all the different things from here, they allow oxygen, glucose and salt through. So you end up with a 99% water, glucose and oxygen in the ventricles. You end up with exactly the same in the brain. They are food. They are food for the cells, they are oxygen for the cells, and they are salt for the neurons and the axons. The electrical charges in the axons is produced by the salt. What they don't show in the pictures of the ventricles and the choroplexus, they say it happens. They say this filters both ways, that it will filter out cranial fluid from the blood supply, and they say that it will also filter back in toxins and carbon dioxide. But they don't show that in the pictures. They just say, they will just show cranial fluid flowing out. There's no image of anything flowing in that is giving the toxins back to the blood to flow away. This is the third part of the blood-brain barrier that stops people detoxifying on an image, in that they just show the fluid coming out. They don't show how the toxins and carbon dioxide flow back in. This flows out into a cave. There's nowhere in that cave to use up the oxygen, the glucose and the salt. There's no cells in that cave for that fluid. The only place it's going to get used up is in the brain, and the only way, this is about a quarter of the blood supply, so by not showing the fluid flowing back into it, that you're dispensing with a quarter of the ability of your brain to detoxify in that image. The only way that toxins can come into this and flow out in the venous blood is that the endofluid from within the brain flows into the ventricles. The used endofluid from the brain flows into here full of carbon dioxide, full of toxins, flows through this and out through the venous blood. That is the only way that can work. And that's not shown. And if that were to be shown, the whole image that is shown of the cranial fluid would just disappear, because from the very start it is a complete mix of endofluid and ependymal fluid. That is why I've changed the names, because just by using the old names pulls you into this paradigm of the blood-brain barrier, nothing working, the brain not being able to detoxify. So there's no image of the ventricles detoxifying the brain, which means that whatever percentage of blood is leaving the brain by the venous blood there is wasted. If you have an image of the cranial fluid from the brain flowing into the ventricles, and that is detoxified from the ventricles into the blood. I think every single cranial therapist should come and do this, to be honest. Or anybody who holds that image of how the brain works, the detoxification of the brain or the cranial fluid. At least they would have a different view. They may not believe it, but they would have the option of a different view. So here is a picture of inside the brain, the cells. They're not close together like cells in the body. They've got tentacles, and there's starfish, and there's sea anemones, and the cranial sea can just flow through that. And this is a ventricle. There's just nothing in it. The The fluid here is exactly the same as the fluid here. And what I was saying before, here the fluid is being used up. The cells are turning the glucose and oxygen, they're using that, and that's giving off carbon dioxide and maybe toxins as well. You also have cranial fluid in here, but it's not being used. And you also have the choroid plexus in here that is producing that cranial fluid. The only way for that choroid plexus venous blood to be useful is if all of this fluid, including the CO2 or the carbon dioxide, whatever's coming off, and the toxins, that has to flow into the ventricles and then out through the choroid plexus. And when it does that, these two fluids are no longer separate. They become the same fluid. They become the cranial sea. Okay, so that is what we've got inside our brain. Very 99% water, very aqueous solution through the whole brain, in the ventricles, around the brain, and then we've got the dura, this sac containing that fluid. I don't know what they call it, when you think something is true, hypothesis, or the way I experience it is that fluid, 99% water, at least infuses into the dura, if not can actually go through the dura into the lymph on the other side. And in doing that, there's a light that comes down into this aqueous center. This is the center of our body. It's water, and the ventricles in the center of that center of our body are pure water. It's just water in them. There's no cells. Spiritual energies can come down into that. Water, salt water, is a perfect medium for channeling. That energies can come down through that system and spread out. The whole intelligence coming down into that medium can absorb into water. Water has a memory. The spiritual qualities can come into it. The water will not just allow that to flow through, but will take that into their memories. This flows out through the nerves and out through the whole body, healing the whole body. Flows out through the dura, healing the dura. It's not this impermeable shield around that. It flows into it, and that light is healing the dura. And once the dura is breathing and filled with light, it becomes a channel for the Kundalini to travel and light up around the whole brain. And all I can say is from there, that spreads out through your whole system, the connective tissue through your whole system.